Vice President Harris yesterday did sit for that first TV interview as the Democratic nominee for president. Harris and her running mate, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, spoke with CNN while campaigning in Georgia. The vice president was asked about day one of her presidency and was pressed on criticism that she has shifted away from some of her more liberal policy positions.
Day one, it's going to be about, one, implementing my plan for what I call an opportunity economy. I've already laid out a number of proposals in that regard, which include what we're going to do to bring down the cost of everyday goods, what we're going to do to invest in America's small businesses, what we're going to do to invest in families. For example, extending the child tax credit to $6,000 for families for the first year of their child's life to help them buy a car seat, to help them buy baby clothes, a crib. There's the work that we're going to do that is about investing in the American family around affordable housing, a big issue in our country right now. So there are a number of things on day one. I think the most important and most significant aspect of my policy perspective and decisions is my values have not changed. You mentioned the Green New Deal. I have always believed, and I have worked on it, that the climate crisis is real, that it is an urgent matter to which we should apply metrics that include holding ourselves to deadlines around time. We did that with the Inflation Reduction Act. We have set goals for the United States of America and, by extension, the globe around when we should meet certain standards for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, as an example. That value has not changed. My value around what we need to do to secure our border, that value has not changed. I spent 2 terms as the Attorney General of California prosecuting transnational criminal organizations, violations of American laws regarding the illegal passage of guns, drugs, and human beings across our border. My values have not changed. One, I am so proud to have served as Vice President to Joe Biden. And 2, I am so proud to be running with Tim Walz for President of the United States and to bring America what I believe the American people deserve, which is a new way forward, and turn the page on the last decade of what I believe has been contrary to where the spirit of our country really lies.
But the last decade, of course, the last 3.5 years has been part of your administration.
I'm talking about an era that started about a decade ago, where there is some suggestion, warped I believe it to be, that the measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you beat down, instead of where I believe most Americans are, which is to believe that the true measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you lift up. That's what's at stake as much as any other detail that we could discuss in this election.
So, Eddie Glaude, one of the big questions going into this first interview was how she would answer some specific questions about clear policy differences, her positions from the 2020 campaign when she was campaigning in 2019 and where she stands now as the nominee. And we're going to get to some of those specifics in just a moment. Her overarching response to that was, my values haven't changed. I've come to understand some of these issues a little bit differently, and therefore I've landed in a different place on issues like fracking. But I'm just curious, given that this was her first sit-down interview as the Democratic nominee, your impressions?
Well, it's great to see you, Willie. I think she did well. She didn't do any harm. That's important. But I also thought the answer about the shift in the positions between 2019 and today was really, really spot on. You know, we could have values that constitute the through line of our positions, but the context changed, the situation changed, our experiences change. And by virtue of that, we make decisions. You know, it's early in the morning to be quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson, but, you know, he says a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, a foolish consistency. And that has everything to do with judging your commitments over and against the changing circumstances. So I thought she answered that question really, really powerfully. And there were some other powerful moments, too. So the final judgment for me, she did no harm. She set the stage for the next time she sits down.
Eddie, we'll take Emerson or James Baldwin from you at any hour of any day. So you get a pass on that always. Jeremy Peters, this obviously was a big moment for the vice president. Her nominee to be vice president at her side, Tim Walz, was there as well. But this really was an interview about the candidate, about who she is, because there are open and fair questions about why she has changed so dramatically on so many key issues. What is the sense inside the campaign about how that interview went yesterday?
I think, Willie, the most telling phrase and probably the most important to Kamala Harris's appeal to the kind of voters she'll need to win was that phrase that she used about where most Americans are. I think overall what we heard from her last night really was a repudiation of the politics that dominated the Democratic Party in 2020, when she was, of course, running in the Democratic primary and had to stake out some positions that were not popular with most Americans. I mean, you know, she said that she was, she reversed herself on the decriminalization of border crossings. She said that, she would support fracking. She said that she would appoint a Republican, or that she would consider appointing a Republican to her cabinet. I mean, this is about as far from the Kamala Harris of 2019, 2020 as I could have imagined. And it's much more in step with where the kinds of voters are that she will need to win over in Michigan, Pennsylvania, suburban Atlanta, suburban Phoenix, because the policies that a lot of Democrats were trying to embrace because they thought that's where the party was in 2020 were really out of step with the concerns of most Americans. And that became evident when the Democratic Party rejected candidates like Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren in 2020, and went with the centrist Joe Biden. So I think she's really positioned herself in a way that should scare Republicans. I know that Republicans were scrambling yesterday to try to figure out how to push back on this interview. They once again have kind of failed to land a punch on Harris. And what you see, I think, is the kind of soaring rhetoric from her about uniting the country that a lot of people are really hungry for.
And the criticism you hear from the Trump campaign and Republicans that they hope will take hold with independent voters is that Vice President Harris doesn't quite know who she is. She was someone in 2019 and in the Senate that she's saying she's not now. But she answered specific questions to get into it a little bit more closely here. Vice President Harris pressed on those evolving policy positions, including on the question of fracking.
Do you still want to ban fracking?
No, and I made that clear on the debate stage in 2020, that I would not ban fracking. As vice president, I did not ban fracking. As president, I will not ban fracking.
In 2019, I believe, at a town hall, you said you were asked, would you commit to implementing a federal ban on fracking on your first day in office? And you said, there's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So yes. So it changed in that campaign?
In 2020, I made very clear where I stand. We are in 2024, and I've not changed that position, nor will I going forward. I kept my word, and I will keep my word.
What made you change that position at the time?
Well, let's be clear. My values have not changed. I believe it is very important that we take seriously what we must do to guard against what is a clear crisis in terms of the climate. And to do that, we can do what we have accomplished thus far. The Inflation Reduction Act, what we have done to invest, by my calculation, over probably $1 trillion over the next 10 years, investing in a clean energy economy. What we've already done, creating over 300,000 new clean energy jobs. That tells me, from my experience as vice president, we can do it without banning fracking. In fact, Dana, I cast the tie-breaking vote that actually increased leases for fracking as vice president. So I'm very clear about where I stand.
And was there some policy or scientific data that you saw that you said, oh, okay, I get it now?
What I have seen is that we can grow and we can increase a thriving clean energy economy without banning fracking.
So Sam Stein, pretty clear there. She says, in 2019, I said I wanted to ban fracking. In 2020, when I became the vice presidential nominee, I came on board with the position that we were not going to ban fracking, and I hold that position today. The subtext, because Dana Bash did a good job asking specific questions then about immigration, how she's changed on a series of policies, the subtext is, forget everything I said in 2019 when I was running in a Democratic primary. The person you should look at is the one sitting before you today and the one who was on the stage with Joe Biden in 2020.
Right. I mean, yes, that is the subtext. I've always wondered in these situations, could someone go full Bulworth, not Bulwark, Bulworth, and just be like, look, I was running in the Democratic primary, I needed to get some progressive votes, and now I'm not. You know, like, would that work?
Yeah.
Probably not. But that is probably the truth, or close to it. I mean, there is some validity to the idea that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, did spend, historic amounts of money to prop up the clean energy economy. Obviously, that's helped pursue that economy and grow it in a way that allows for fracking. But, if we're being frank about it, fracking is a huge industry, or a relatively huge industry in a critical swing state of Pennsylvania, and you don't want to offend that industry. There's no good answers really to give to that question. I thought she, did what she had to do, which is assert her position, explain it as best she can, and move on. And this is, again, I'm a broken record here, but, this is why you probably should do more interviews, is that you get these things out of the way so that you can move on to more favorable terrain. And I imagine this will come up again during the debate, and I'm sure she'll have the same exact answer.
The election is going to come down to a small group of undecided voters in only about 7 states, basically. People who tend not to be diehard partisans, because if they were, they'd already know who they're voting for. And a key part of President Joe Biden's 2020 victory was convincing enough conservative or Republican voters to cross party lines and support him in states like Georgia and Arizona. It's a strategy that Harris-Walz's campaign is, of course, trying to emulate. The Democratic convention featured many Republicans backing Harris and trying to create a kind of permission structure to their fellow party members to do the same.
Now, I'm not left-wing, period. But I believe our leaders should bring out the best in us, not the worst. That's why I'm voting for Kamala Harris. She's tough. She's going to tackle inflation. Trump will make it worse. I'm voting for Kamala Harris because she'll make us proud to be American again.
Kyle Sweetser is a 2-time Trump voter from Alabama, publicly backed Harris at the DNC, as you just heard. Robert Nix is a former Trump voter from Pennsylvania, and they're now involved with the group Republican Voters Against Trump, who put them on billboards urging their fellow Republicans not to back the former president, and they joined me now. It's good to have you gentlemen both. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having
Thanks
us.
for having me.
Kyle, let me start with you, because if I'm not mistaken, you live in Alabama, which is a pretty conservative place. Trump's going to win there by 20 points or something like that. And you are a 2-time Trump voter. And I guess I tend to think, people that went back the second time, 16, 20, pretty locked in, but not you. What changed your mind?
Yeah, so I voted in for Trump in 2016. I thought he was a good change of pace. I thought the people, especially down here, were not well represented. In 2018, we had those steel tariffs, and those started to affect some products. So I got to see the firsthand effects of those probably before anyone else. The inflation started then. And in 2020, after all the things that Trump said, I was actually kind of holding my nose to vote for him, kind of to beat the Democrats, that kind of thing. So I just assumed he was going to go away. I assumed it was over with, especially after January 6th. And, in 2022, when I started paying closer attention to geopolitics and what was going on in the world, I started to really look at Trump's record, especially on foreign policy and the things that he said, and his coddling of dictators and enemies, essentially the United States. And I started to look really close at his record, and he's a disaster.
Robert, you were a Trump voter, I think, in Pennsylvania in 2016, and then did vote for President Joe Biden in 2020. Is that right?
I did. I voted for Biden. I did, in fact, like Kyle said, I held my nose and I voted for Biden, but because I simply couldn't bring myself to vote for Trump. In fact, the reason I'm involved with Republican voters against Trump and on billboards and writing op-eds is because I think I'm trying to atone for even voting for Trump in 2016 and make up for my mistake.
And there's some people, I think, who would maybe sort of go from Trump, and vote for Biden. Maybe they come back in the fold or not. But you're now devoted. What was it for you that pried you away from Trump?
Well, initially, I mean, from his very first term, I began to see the problems right away with the undermining of the press, undermining of the Constitution, in particular the rule of law, in particular the checks and balances that hold our government together. He's flaunted all of that, and it looked like we were headed towards disaster, just in his first term. And then came, and then I couldn't vote for him after that, but then came the loss of 2020 where he created the big lie. He's instigated an insurrection. I thought, how can he possibly even run in 2024, much less how people could support him? So, yeah, I am appalled as I watched the Republican Party that I've been involved with for 44 years, and not just as a voter, but I've run it for office as a Republican. I've helped Hispanic outreach all over the state of Pennsylvania, with Bush, going back to Bush Cheney in 2004, helping Senators Santorum and Specter with Hispanic outreach, the Republican State Committee working for them doing Hispanic outreach. And now to see what the Republican Party has been reduced to by Trump is just, it turns my stomach and it appalls me. And so, yes, I could never vote for him again. And I work very hard to try to make as many people as I can aware of the problems that we're facing here. It's not the issues. It's the over problem of the destruction of our form of government is what I fear. And then I think too many people think it's just a normal race between Democrats and Republicans. And I got to go with issues like immigration, inflation, or Israel, or abortion. But those we can get by with bad policy. We can survive it, as Liz Cheney said, but we can't survive the undermining and trampling of our Constitution. That's the basis for what I believe in now.
It's so interesting to listen to you two gentlemen, because there's this kind of, I think, a little tired and trite, pundit conventional wisdom that, voters, the real voters, don't care about things like foreign policy, democracy. They care about kitchen table issues. And yet here you are both talking about how your trajectories, one talking about foreign policy, you, Robert, talking about democracy. Let me come back to you on that, Kyle, on foreign policy. It's interesting you mentioned that, because a lot of times, again, the conventional wisdom is like, people don't really care that much about it. Well, what specifically was there? Was it the Ukraine war? Was there something where you started to be like, this is not right, that got you?
Yeah, so I just started to pay attention to Trump and basically his orbit and the things they say. And it was startling how they were pretty much pushing the same talking points as Russia. I started to look back at Trump's record on, S-230, trying to come after freedom of speech and tie it into funding in 2020. Just all those things and the tariffs and the trade and all that. I don't think people really understand that a lot of these things affect the prices that we have now, and they cause inflation. Yes. It's just wild that there's not enough effort to educate voters on how important foreign policy is, how important trade policy is, and really how that Trump himself has completely thrown out conservative economic and trade policies. He's not fiscally responsible. If you look at the current rate or the federal budget, I think that he's proposed is 5 times what the Democrats have proposed. That's insane. In 2020, Trump had the single highest year rate of murder rate in 2020. So he's not a law and order president.
Yeah, and that point about tariffs, I mean, he's proposing right now, at a minimum, a 10% sales tax on every imported good in the country, which I think is underappreciated. Robert, let me give a last question to you in the little bit of time we have here. I know how you feel about Trump. You were a Republican. There's a crucial down-ballot race in your state. David McCormick is running against the incumbent Democratic senator there. What is your feeling about that race?
Well, it's for me, if you have been endorsed by or endorsed Trump, you're tainted with the same problem that has taken over the entire Republican Party. There's only a very few Republicans left, in my view, and they include Liz Cheney or Larry Hogan or Adam Kinzinger and everybody else. If you're going to endorse, I mean, just to see even Haley, after she dropped out, endorse Trump, then made me sick. So, yes, David McCormick is tainted in my view as well. The only way to fix the Republican Party is almost like to burn it down to the ground and start over. And anybody who's either endorsed or supporting him or in any way affiliated with Trumpism we have to start over. It's like a mattress with bed bugs. You think you can spray it with insecticide. You think maybe you can steam, but no, you got to burn it and throw it out and start over. And so that's how I feel about anybody who's been endorsed by or endorses or supports or stands on the same stage with Trump.
Yeah, time for a new mattress, Kyle Sweetser and Robert Nix.
Simone, I want to ask you first, you know the vice president well. What's your takeaway from this interview?
I think the campaign should be proud this morning. You know, they're the top of the ticket, went out and did what she needed to do. And I also think Governor Walz answered some questions that people who are not familiar with him, right, that they needed to have answered, even though some of the things that have surfaced that he spoke to last night about his military record, right? These are things that if you live in Minnesota and have voted for Tim Walz before, or just familiar with him at all, you have heard this before. But look, I think, Jose, some of the discourse over the last couple of weeks, 2 weeks specifically, would have you believe that Vice President Harris hadn't done an interview since she became the vice president. And I think sitting there last night, it was clear that she was comfortable answering questions. I thought Dana Bash also did a good job pulling the layers back, if you will, asking the questions that people wanted to get the answers to. Always, people want more. And I think the best thing to happen going forward is, frankly, that we, the American people, get more opportunities to hear from the Democratic ticket in various ways. And so I would also expect that they should do additional interviews going forward, print interviews, in addition to what the vice president has been doing, is gaggling at the side of her plane. But the no harm done in the interview and a little news broken. So that's good from a comms perspective.
Yeah, and I want to play for you one of this is really kind of an interesting and significant, I thought, moment when the vice president was asked about those race-based attacks from Trump. Listen to what she had to say and how she handled it.
I want to ask you about is what he said last month. He suggested that you happened to turn black recently for political purposes, questioning a core part of your identity.
Yeah. Same old tired playbook. Next question, please.
That's it?
That's it.
How do you think she handled that, Simone?
Yeah, you could see the body, as much as what she said, same old tired playbook. I also am looking at the body language and the look on her face. And the look on her face said to me, this assertion from Donald Trump is ridiculous. What she said is really important because in an interview like this, had Vice President Harris spoken to the attacks that Donald Trump had lobbed against her and these just really ridiculous criticisms, that would have been the news coming out of the interview. Everything else she said about putting a Republican in her cabinet if she is elected, to what she would do on day one, to her economic policy, to even her explanation about fracking and whatnot. None of those things would have been the headline. The headline would have been Vice President Harris responds to Donald Trump for the first time. And I believe that is one of the chief reasons why you did not hear more from her. Now, a debate stage is going to be a little bit different, though, Jose. And so I know the debate is going to be moderated by Lindsey Davis and David Muir at ABC. And I don't know if that's it is going to be enough there. But in an interview, that's what a candidate should do.
And David, one of the biggest issues, no doubt, for this campaign is the economy. Here's what the vice president had to say about her day one agenda and the economy.
Day one, it's going to be about, one, implementing my plan for what I call an opportunity economy. I've already laid out a number of proposals in that regard, which include what we're going to do to bring down the cost of everyday goods, what we're going to do to invest in America's small businesses, what we're going to do to invest in families, for example, extending the child tax credit to $6,000 for families for the first year of their child's life to help them buy a car seat, to help them buy baby clothes, a crib. There's the work that we're going to do that is about investing in the American family around affordable housing, a big issue in our country right now.
David, how effective do you think this line was? Because, you know, there's a criticism of where is the specificity, and on the other hand, she answered it with some specificity.
Yeah, look, I don't think voters are necessarily looking for specificity so much as they're looking for an outline of where a president would take the country if elected. Also, what's really important here, and I thought the vice president did this well, is to meet voters where they are and let them know that the issues that concern them concern the candidate, right? So as she has said before, but she repeated here, and it's important, that prices remain too high even though inflation has cooled. The American people know it, and so do I. That is what she has said repeatedly. She said it again. One of the ways in which candidates often trip up is they don't speak to the candidates, to the voters, where they are in terms of the issues that most concern them. They don't acknowledge them. And this is something she has done. Now, what she is going to have to do moving forward, I think, is do a better job of explaining her shift in positions on fracking and fossil fuel exploration, on enforcing the border. She's started to do that, but I think she needs to be a little bit more proactive in terms of explaining not just my position on fracking is different. Obviously, this is a huge issue in Pennsylvania, which many people consider a must-win state, maybe a must-win state. So what you want to be able to do is do what the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, told me last week when I asked him this question about the vice president's shift, is to explain not just that this is my position and you can trust it, but it's my position because it's a huge job creator in Pennsylvania and in other states. And I am concerned about jobs, even though I'm also concerned about the environment. So I think putting some more meat on the bone in terms of why she now thinks her new positions are the better positions is going to help guard against the attacks from the Trump campaign, which are totally understandable and within bounds, which is, why can we trust you if you used to believe this and now you believe that? It's the same sort of attack Democrats make when talking about the choice issue and abortion rights, with the president, the former president, trying to moderate his position on abortion rights and IVF. And the attack is always, we can't trust you because of where you've been. So in order for the vice president to head these attacks off and really capitalize, it can't just simply be, I've changed my position, but this is why I believe in my new position.
Yeah, I mean, and Simone, these are things that can be flushed out in, you know, following interviews, and certainly if you have the time to ask her specifics on, well, let's talk about fracking. I think that I agree with you that there was some questioning on that last night, Simone, but where does and how does a campaign deal with what David was talking about? This line of attack, for example, that there is a flip-flopper.
Look, I think that there's a difference between what someone, not even a difference, but I think it boils down to what somebody believes. And belief is anchored in values, which is why I think the Harris campaign and the vice president herself settled on wanting to talk about her values. I'm pretty sure that they anticipated that this was one of these kinds of questions could come up. And there are various ways to answer it. What Governor Shapiro suggested is, in fact, one way to do it. But, OK, there are lots of job creators around the country, right? So are we going to make this one exception for fracking? What about this over here? So that's when you answer in that way, then you start to parse it. When you anchor something in your values, that's a little bit different. And she went further to say, which I thought was very smart. She said, when I had the opportunity, I was the person that cast a tie-breaking vote in the United States Senate to open up new leases. She said, so my record says that I have kept my promise. So it's not just what she said in her campaign in 2019 and then what she's saying now. It's also what she's done in between. And when given the opportunity, she did not shy away from, again, casting the tie-breaking vote that opened up new leases. So if she wanted to ban fracking, that's not something she would have done. And so that's a juxtaposition from Donald Trump, who, what he's saying, but also what he has done.
And David, Governor Walz was asked about misstatements that he made when he talked about holding a weapon of war, which Republicans have also seized on. Here was his answer.
The idea that you said that you were in war.
Yeah.
Did you misspeak, as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar's not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog. I'm not going to do that. And the one thing I'll never do is I'll never demean another member's service in any way. I never have, and I never will.
What do you think of that line there, David?
Well, I thought it was a little bit weak. I mean, he didn't really address the misstatement, and there have been a series of misstatements that we found out about since he was announced as the vice president's running mate. I just don't think at the end of the day it's going to matter all of that much. Usually when voters assess vice presidential candidates, what they want to know is that you can pass the commander-in-chief test if you're called to serve in that position. Where other running mates have gone wrong is when they don't meet that test. So I think this is a distraction for the Harris campaign. It's an annoyance. It hasn't really gotten in the way of their momentum so far. I thought he could have done more to put this issue to bed by just saying flat out, yes, I did this. Yes, I shouldn't have. Asked, answered, and then moved on to the pivot, which I thought was a very politically adept and well executed pivot. But he's going to continue to be asked about this. He'll be confronted with it in the debate with J.D. Vance, no doubt. But it's just not the sort of thing that's going to derail a campaign. Look, even J.D. Vance, for all of the faux pas he experienced in the opening weeks of his, after becoming Trump's running mate, that's not going to derail Trump. Only Trump will derail Trump if that's what happens.
And joining us now, former communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris, Ashley Etienne. So interestingly, when Donald Trump's going out and saying that he would potentially not vote for a 6-week ban in Florida, it's putting a lot of pro-life groups in a weird position. They're angry with him, and NBCNews.com and Sahil Kapoor compiled just a ton of reporting on this. The head of the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America group called Trump on Thursday, according to a source with knowledge, and told her that she didn't like this. Trump told her he didn't state a position on the amendment in his home state's ballot this fall. You also have another evangelical theologian saying that Donald Trump's criticism of Florida abortion restrictions and his call for government funding on IVF and his recent statement about reproductive rights seem almost calculated to alienate pro-life voters. Eric Erickson saying if he loses, this is what's going to cost him the victory. It's what's going to cost him the White House. I can go on. There are more. Why, I know you're a Democrat, but why do you think Donald Trump is now trying to moderate on this issue?
Listen, I'm a Democrat that's incredibly gleeful at this moment. Donald Trump's totally deteriorating. I mean, he's desperate to find new voters. I mean, he realizes that this issue has been a winner for Democrats over the last 2 cycles since he reversed Roe v. Wade. I mean, and he bragged about doing that. So this will continue to be a winning issue for Democrats. This is why Vice President Harris and Governor Walz are going to be barnstorming the country, kicking off their reproductive rights tour in Palm Beach, which I just find incredibly Trump-esque. They're needling him in his own backyard, and it also suggests that Florida is still in place. So this is an issue where he's actually trying to reverse himself because he realizes such a loser for his party. But I don't think he can. I mean, the reality is women will not be fooled by this sort of fake change of heart by the former president.
What about his proposal to make IVF paid for by the federal government? That is something that a lot of families would really like. It is very expensive. Private insurance will pay for a couple rounds of it, but that's it.
I mean, I don't know who would believe Donald Trump's word. I mean, he also said Mexico was going to pay for the wall. He said he was going to lower health care costs. He did none of that. He said he was going to reverse Obamacare, which he did not do at all. Still hasn't come up with a health care plan. So the reality is this should settle the hearts of Republicans. But Donald Trump is not serious about this. This is actually just pandering at its worst to try to get votes. But I don't know who's going to be fooled by the president here or who even believes that he's even sincere about doing what he's saying that he's going to do, because again, he has a habit and a history of failing to make good on his promises.
So we saw Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz sit down for an interview with CNN's Dana Bash yesterday, and they got into policy a little bit, but there has been this criticism out there that they're not going far enough in. She's only been on the campaign trail for a few weeks, just got nominated a couple weeks ago. She also was part of an administration whose policy is pretty clear. Is it your sense that voters really don't know where she stands?
No, I don't think that this is even an issue in the minds of most voters. I mean, if you look at where she is in the polls, she's surging in the polls. But also the metrics by which you measure the strength of an election or candidacy right now is based on the money. She's got $540 million in the bank, 200,000 volunteers. That's the measure of the strength of a candidacy. And it's also the measure of momentum. So she's got momentum behind her. I think this is a Washington, D.C. inside the Beltway kind of a controversy that's really being stoked by Republicans because they have very little else to attack Kamala Harris on, and nothing that they've attacked her on so far is actually landing. She rolled out an entire economic agenda maybe 2 weeks ago, very detailed, talking about increasing availability of housing, of affordability of housing, going after price gouging to lower the cost of lower costs for American families, put more money in their pockets. You know, she also talked about her history of really going after corporate greed. So I'm not sure what I feel like this is just a reach on the part of the Republican Party because they can't find any other thing to land on the vice president.
She got into details on housing and talked about getting rid of zoning restrictions and giving more money to developers to juice the number of houses that are built. She also talked about a $6,000 child tax credit for the first year that you have a baby, including more tax credits during the duration of their childhood. So there was a little bit more meat on the bone for those policies. The price gouging one, though, not a lot of indication of how she would actually get that one done, because the definition of price gouging can vary. I do want to ask you, though, about the debates. And there is still this, back and forth about whether the mics will be muted during the duration of the debate. This is obviously something that President Biden had asked for. They got for the first debate. Kamala Harris doesn't want it. If she's not able to get her way with that, to make the mics turned on for the duration of the debate, do you think that she can still effectively show that Donald Trump, or still effectively get under his skin the way the campaign wants to?
Absolutely. I mean, she's a former prosecutor who, as I continuously say on television, my experience with her is that she suffers no fools. So I think what she's probably prepping to do is to figure out how to strategically needle Donald Trump, how to get under his skin. But there's also one other thing, is I know there's nothing that unhinges Donald Trump more than a strong, powerful woman challenging him. I used to be Speaker Pelosi's communications director, and I remember those years where she stood up to him and he totally crumbled. And I think that's what's going to happen in this debate. So either mic's on or mic's off, he's going to continue to be Donald Trump. That's exactly what the campaign wants. But I think what she's going to try to do is strategically needle him to get under his skin to make him actually unravel.
Is it an advantage or a disadvantage that she's never met him?
I don't think either matters, but I think it could be an advantage that she's not met him. But here's the thing. We know everything there is to know about Donald Trump. You don't have to meet him to know him, right? And so we know him to be a very small, petty, simple-minded individual who could care less about the American people, only cares about himself, and that's what he's demonstrated. So I think the split screen with him on one side, her on the other, him looking small, angry like yesterday, and her looking like the very promise of America is going to really resonate with people, and it's going to tell the entire story. Because Donald Trump's proven, and, the Republican Party could say it better than I can, that he can't help himself, but be Donald Trump, and that's going to always work to her advantage. So whether she's met him or not, it's not going to matter much.
I was talking to Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report yesterday, and she was saying, looking at the polling right now, these debates could really truly make a difference in where this election goes. Ashley Etienne, thank you so much for joining us. It's really good to have you. Joining us now, national affairs correspondent with The Nation, John Nichols, and NBC News senior business correspondent, Christine Romans. So these numbers are potentially pretty significant for Kamala Harris. The economy has dogged Democrats for a long, long time. And even although the economic data that we have shows that we're in a pretty good place, people weren't feeling it. Does it make a difference that even if they say we were better off under Donald Trump, for them not to blame the current state of things on Kamala Harris?
It's interesting, just like she said last night in that interview with Dana Bash, it seems as though some of these voters in swing states have turned the page on their vibe session, and they're kind of turning the page on the Democratic leader. And maybe some of that energy around her over the past few weeks is rubbing off in this way. But you look at what these voters are saying about how she would handle things that matter to the middle class. They give her high marks, and she's narrowing the gap on a lot of other things. Although they still say that Donald Trump would be better for gas prices in the stock market. And it's one of those things that's facts versus feelings. The stock market's at record highs.
The economy is one of those weirdly partisan things where the second a president gets elected that you like, suddenly you feel good about the economy, even though there's been no actual change in the economic state of your household. It is very much a vibe. How do you address a vibe?
Exactly. And that's what the White House, the Biden White House, has been struggling with and trying to do for months and months. And now it's the Harris campaign that has the same issue. How do you tell people, no, the economy is great, when they don't feel it, for whatever reason, don't feel it themselves? Then you look tone deaf. So that is the challenge for the Harris campaign. I think we're going to be hearing more about the care economy or her aides have told me you're going to hear more about the care economy. She's going to try to really zero in on the middle class and the things you feel every day, like child care and other things. Those are positions that Donald Trump hasn't really taken.
Child care and housing and the cost at the grocery store, talking about going against what she says is price gouging at the grocery store. John Nichols, you're seeing her talk about this in front of a lot of union workers, but also talking about unions a lot, even when she's not in front of union workers. Why is that?
Look, there's a couple things going on here that are important. And first and foremost, Harris appears to be solidifying a lot of support among trade unions. She's getting the key endorsements, and the enthusiasm level is big. That still means, though, that the unions have to go internally and talk to their own members. They've got to do a lot of mobilization. And if they've got this ammunition, somewhat of a better attitude toward the economy, they combine that with Harris's pro-union message, and that's how you start to really boost numbers. So in talking to union leaders as we head toward Labor Day, one of the things that's been really striking to me is how so many of them think that they really can market this ticket, for lack of a better term. They can talk about this ticket to members and actually up those numbers. Because remember, with unions, there's always a substantial portion of folks who vote Republican. That's always been true under many different Democratic candidates. In this case, though, if Harris can maximize her union vote, get it up as high as possible, perhaps even higher than Joe Biden, that's going to be incredibly beneficial to her in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, but also in states where unions have a capacity that's rising, places like Arizona.
Well, because none of these voting groups, whether they're union members or Latino voters or women voters, no one's a monolith. Everybody has different pushes and pulls, different priorities, and they're looking for a candidate to express those priorities. They might be religious in some cases. They might be purely economic in others. They might be about national security. There is a host of different issues that play into it beyond just who you're identified as being a part of, what group you're identified as being a part of. The firefighters union, to go back to unions specifically, J.D. Vance and Governor Tim Walz have both spoken to that group. I know you've written about it. Let me play a little bit of J.D. Vance at the firefighters union in Boston.
I can promise you this. When Vice President Harris and I win this election, we'll have your back just like you've had ours this entire time.
President Trump and I are proud to be the most pro-worker Republican ticket in history, and I want to talk about why we're fighting for working people, why we're going to fight for unions and non-union alike.
The good news is we had both of them at the firefighters union, and you could hear in the room there was a different reception. Did that play throughout?
Yeah, they clearly got different responses. Walz has been very close to the firefighters union for a long time up in Minnesota. He knew exactly how to talk to that union, and frankly, they knew him. When Vance came in and suggested that somehow the Republicans were very pro-union, it just didn't go over well. Now, remember, the firefighters are a union that has yet to endorse, and so this juxtaposition was very instructive. And I can tell you, people not just within the firefighters, but across the labor were looking at how J.D. Vance just didn't seem to connect. And that's a big deal because Vance has pitched himself as a Republican who talked to labor.